The summer heat pressed down on the lake house, making every inch of the day feel slow and heavy. It was the kind of afternoon where time seemed to stretch endlessly, where even the cicadas sounded tired. I sat on the porch swing, my legs tucked beneath me, enjoying the rare moment of quiet while the rest of the family was at the lake. Grandpa Henry was somewhere in the house, probably fixing something or tidying up like he always did. He was never the type to sit still, even at his age. To everyone else, he was the glue that held our family together. Always cracking jokes, offering advice, or slipping candy to the little kids when no one was looking. To me, he was something more. A steady presence in my life, someone I could always count on. I flipped through the pages of a book I wasn't really reading, distracted by the sound of footsteps creaking on the porch behind me. "Why aren't you down at the lake with the others?" Grandpa Henry's voice was warm and familiar, carrying a faint note of curiosity. I glanced up to see him standing in the doorway, a glass of iced tea in his hand. He leaned against the frame, his easy smile lighting up his face. "I just needed a break," I said, closing the book and setting it on the swing beside me. "Too much sun," he chuckled, stepping out onto the porch. "Can't say I blame you. Can't say I blame you. Feels like an oven out there." He sat down in the chair across from me, setting his glass on the small table between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence filled only by the rustling of leaves and the distant laughter of my cousins at the lake. "You know," he said after a while, leaning back in his chair, "your grandma used to love days like this." He smiled, glancing over at him. "I remember. She used to make us sit out here and tell stories until the sun went down." We both fell quiet again, and I thought about how much I missed her. She'd been gone for almost 3 years, but it still felt like she might walk through the door at any moment, carrying a tray of lemonade and cookies. Grandpa Henry cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Do you remember how she used to make me dance with her on the porch?" I nodded, smiling at the memory. She'd put on music and pull you out of your chair no matter how much you protested. He grinned, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "She always won those battles." He paused, his gaze shifting to the empty space beside me. "Want to give it a try?" "For old time's sake." I laughed, certain he was joking. "What, dancing? Here, why not?" he said, standing up and holding out his hand. "No one's around to laugh at us." For a moment, I hesitated, but the playful glint in his eyes reminded me of Grandma and how she never let anyone take life too seriously. With a shrug, I set my book aside and took his hand. The wooden boards of the porch creaked softly under our feet as we swayed to an imaginary tune. Grandpa Henry hummed an old song, his voice low and slightly off-key, but comforting in its familiarity. "I'm not exactly a pro at this." "It's not about being a pro," he said. "It's about trust." He rested one hand lightly on my waist, steadying me as we moved. It felt strange at first, but his encouragement and occasional chuckles put me at ease. "You've got the rhythm," he said, his smile warm. "You just need a little more confidence." I rolled my eyes, laughing. "Sure, Grandpa." For a while, it was easy to forget everything else, to lose myself in the moment, and the simplicity of moving to the quiet hum of his voice. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the porch. But then, something shifted. His hand, which had been resting innocently on my waist, slid slightly lower. It was subtle, so subtle that I almost didn't notice. But when it lingered for a moment too long, my stomach twisted. I froze, my laughter dying in my throat. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. "Yeah," I said quickly, stepping back and forcing a smile. "I think that's enough dancing for me." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Fair enough. You're a natural, though. Just like your grandma." I mumbled a thank you, my cheeks burning as I turned away and grabbed my book from the swing. As I sat back down, pretending to read, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled in my chest. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, I couldn't forget the way his hand had felt, or the way my heart had started to race. Not from dancing, but from something else entirely. The evening slipped into night, and the lake house glowed under the soft amber light of its old porch lamps. I could hear the distant laughter of my cousins as they returned from the lake, their voices carrying faintly through the open windows. But inside, the house felt quieter than usual, as if it were holding its breath. I sat in the living room, a cup of tea warming my hands, trying to make sense of the strange, lingering feeling in my chest. Grandpa Henry was in the kitchen, rinsing dishes and humming the same tune he'd danced to earlier. His voice was low, soothing even, but it only added to my confusion. What was I feeling? He'd always been someone I could rely on. A father figure in the absence of my own dad. Someone who seemed to understand me in ways others didn't. So why did the memory of his hand on my waist keep replaying in my mind? Want some company? His voice broke through my thoughts. I looked up as he stepped into the room, a dish towel draped over his shoulder. Sure, I said, scooting over on the couch to make room. He smiled, settling down beside me. His presence was familiar, comforting even, and I felt a strange warmth in my chest. The conversation started simply enough. Him asking about my classes, me sharing stories about my professors and friends. It felt normal, easy, like it always did when we talked. But as the night wore on, the lines between familiarity and something else began to blur. Do you ever feel like people don't really see you for who you are? I asked, staring into my tea. He tilted his head, studying me for a moment before answering. Sometimes, I think we all do, especially when we're younger. But you're different, Jenna. You've always had this spark, this way of standing out without even trying. I laughed nervously, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. You're just saying that because you're my grandpa. No, he said, his voice soft but firm. I mean it. You're remarkable, and anyone who doesn't see that is blind. His words hit me in a way I didn't expect, like a gentle nudge against a door I hadn't realized was already open. Thanks, I said quietly, my cheeks warming under his gaze. The moment passed, but something lingered in the air between us, an unspoken connection that I couldn't quite name. I didn't pull away from it, though. If anything, I leaned into it, drawn to the way he made me feel seen in a way that no one else ever had. The rest of the family came back in waves, their laughter filling the house and breaking the quiet tension of the moment. Grandpa Henry excused himself, ruffling my hair as he stood. Don't stay up too late, he said with a wink before disappearing down the hall. I stayed on the couch for a while, watching the shadows from the porch light flicker on the ceiling. I told myself it was just a weird moment, a passing thought that didn't mean any. But deep down, I knew better. The next day, things felt normal again, or at least as normal as they could be. Grandpa Henry was his usual self, cracking jokes at breakfast and sneaking cookies to the little ones when no one was looking. I tried to convince myself that the strange tension from the night before had been in my head, a figment of my imagination. But as the day wore on, I found myself noticing things I hadn't before. The way his hand lingered on my shoulder when he walked by. The way his eyes softened when he looked at me. And the strangest part, I didn't feel the urge to pull away. That evening, while the rest of the family went for a walk along the lake, I stayed behind to help Grandpa Henry clean up after dinner. You didn't have to stay, he said, glancing over at me as he loaded the dishwasher. I don't mind, I said, handing him a plate. For a while we worked in silence, the faint sound of crickets drifting through the open window. Do you remember the last summer we spent here with Grandma? He asked suddenly, his voice quieter now. I nodded. Yeah. She made us all sit on the porch and tell stories every night. She said it was the best way to keep the family close. She was right, he said, his gaze distant. She always had a way of bringing people together. He set the last plate in the dishwasher and closed it, leaning against the counter with a small smile. You remind me of her, you know. Everyone says that, I said, laughing lightly. It's true, he said, stepping closer. You have her grace, her kindness, her heart. His words made my chest tighten, and I felt my breath catch as he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. Grandpa. I started, but my voice trailed off, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. You're incredible, Jenna, he said softly. You always have been. The warmth in his eyes was overwhelming, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I didn't want to look away. The sound of footsteps on the porch broke the moment, and I stepped back quickly, my heart racing. Looks like everyone's back, I said, grabbing a dish towel and pretending to wipe the counter. Yeah, he said, his voice steady but quieter now. As the rest of the family filed into the kitchen, chatting and laughing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had changed. And the scariest part? I wasn't sure I wanted to change it back. The lake house felt smaller the next morning, the walls seeming to press in closer with every passing hour. I couldn't tell if it was the lingering summer heat or something entirely different. Either way, it left me restless. I spent most of the day outside, perched on the edge of the dock with my feet dangling in the water. The soft ripples lapped against my toes, their rhythmic motion doing little to soothe the growing knot in my stomach. I told myself I was overthinking it. Last night was just a moment, a strange, fleeting thing that didn't mean anything. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, the memory of Grandpa Henry's hand brushing my hair, the warmth in his voice, and the way my heart had raced when he looked at me refused to fade. By the time the sun began to set, I was still on the dock, watching the water turn gold beneath the fading light. Grandpa Henry's voice startled me out of my thoughts. Mind some company? He asked, standing at the edge of the path that led to the dock. Of course not, I said quickly, scooting over to make room. He walked over and sat down beside me, his movements slow and deliberate. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it felt heavier than usual, like there were too many unspoken words hanging in the air. Beautiful evening, he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Yeah, I replied, though my voice sounded distant even to me. He glanced at me, his expression softening. You've been quiet today? Something on your mind? I hesitated, my fingers trailing in the water. Just thinking, I guess. About what? Life? School? Everything, I said vaguely, avoiding his gaze. He nodded, his shoulder brushing against mine as he shifted slightly. You've always been a deep thinker. It's one of the things I admire about you. The compliment landed differently this time, making my chest tighten. The conversation drifted after that, touching on light topics. My classes, his plans for the garden back home, the antics of my younger cousins. But as the minutes passed, I became increasingly aware of the closeness between us. When he reached out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind my ear, I didn't pull away. I told myself it was innocent, a grandfatherly gesture, but the warmth of his fingertips lingered long after he'd drawn his hand back. You remind me so much of her, he said quietly, almost to himself. Grandma? He nodded. She had this way of making everything around her seem brighter. Just like you. My breath caught, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. Thanks, I managed finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, his eyes meeting mine in the fading light. You're remarkable, Jenna. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Something in his tone made my pulse quicken, and I felt my cheeks flush. I looked away quickly, staring out at the water as if it could somehow ground me. Later that night, I found myself alone in the living room, flipping through an old photo album I'd found on the bookshelf. Most of the pictures were from years ago, family vacations, birthday parties, and snapshots of Grandma laughing in the garden. I didn't hear Grandpa Henry come in until he spoke. "Found the family archives, huh?" He jumped, clutching the album to my chest. "You scared me." "Didn't mean to," he said with a chuckle, sitting down beside me on the couch. "That was her favorite album, you know. She used to make me sit here and look through it with her, even though I'd seen every picture 100 times. I smiled, opening the album again and flipping to a page of black and white photos from their wedding. "She was beautiful," I said softly. "She was," he agreed, his voice filled with a quiet reverence. "You have her eyes." I glanced at him, my heart skipping a beat at the way he was looking at me. Like I was the only thing in the room that mattered. We sat there for what felt like hours, flipping through the pages and sharing stories about Grandma. At some point, I leaned against him, his arm resting lightly around my shoulders. It felt natural, comforting even. But as the night wore on, the line between comfort and something else began to blur again. "I'm glad you're here," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Me too," I replied, my head resting against his chest. The sound of his heartbeat was steady, soothing, and I found myself closing my eyes, letting the moment wash over me. His hand moved, brushing against my arm before resting on my hand. My eyes fluttered open, and for a moment I froze, unsure of what to do. "Grandpa," I started, my voice trembling. "You're special, Jenna," he said, his voice filled with something I couldn't quite name. "You always have been." I didn't know what to say. My mind was spinning, torn between the warmth his words brought and the unsettling feeling in my chest. Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps in the hallway broke the moment. We both pulled back quickly. The spell shattered as my cousins filed into the living room, laughing and joking about something I didn't catch. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the memory of his hand on mine, or the way his words had made me feel. I told myself it was just him being kind, that I was reading too much into it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. And the scariest part, I wasn't sure I wanted it to be. The air in the lake house felt heavier after that night. I couldn't tell if it was the summer heat or the weight of my own thoughts pressing down on me. Grandpa Henry and I hadn't spoken about what happened in the living room. Not the way he held my hand. Not the way his voice softened as he said those words. But the silence between us carried a strange tension, a quiet acknowledgement of something we both felt but refused to name. That morning, I avoided him, spending most of my time by the lake with my cousins. The cool water and their laughter distracted me, but only for a while. Every now and then, I'd catch myself looking back toward the house, wondering if he was there. If he was thinking about me the way I was thinking about him. After dinner, the family gathered in the backyard for s'mores around the fire pit. The flames crackled and danced, casting flickering shadows across the circle. I sat next to Lindsay, who was too busy joking with one of our cousins to notice how quiet I'd been all evening. Grandpa Henry sat across from me, his face illuminated by the firelight. He caught my eye once, then again, holding my gaze for a moment longer than he should have. My chest tightened, and I quickly looked away, but the warmth that spread through me lingered. When the fire began to die down, the group dispersed, some heading inside while others stayed to clean up. I lingered, unsure if I wanted to leave the safety of the crowd. But when I saw Grandpa Henry still sitting by the fire, something pulled me toward him. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked as I approached, his voice low and quiet. "Not yet," I said, sitting down on the bench beside him. The fire was nothing more than embers now, their faint glow casting a soft light over his face. "Tonight reminded me of all those summers with your grandma," he said, his gaze fixed on the dying fire. She loved nights like this, said they were magical. He smiled faintly. She was right. For a while we sat in silence, the only sound the distant chirping of crickets. Then he turned to me, his eyes searching mine. "Jenna," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of something unspoken. "Yeah." He hesitated, his hand resting on the bench between us. "You've grown into an incredible woman," he said finally. "I don't think I've told you that enough." "You have," I said, my voice trembling. "No," he said, shaking his head. "Not like this. You have a way of seeing a world, of carrying yourself. That's rare. It's beautiful." His words made my heart race, and I felt my breath catch. I wanted to say something, anything, but the intensity in his eyes left me frozen. He reached out slowly, his hand brushing against mine. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I need you to know how much you mean to me." My mind was spinning, torn between the warmth his words brought and the overwhelming weight of what they implied. "Grandpa, Shh," he said gently, his thumb brushing against the back of my hand. "You don't have to say anything." The sound of the back door opening snapped us both out of the moment. I pulled my hand away quickly, my heart pounding as Lindsay stepped onto the porch. "Jenna, you coming in?" she called, oblivious to the tension in the air. I glanced at Grandpa Henry, his face unreadable in the dim light. He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement, and I turned to follow Lindsay inside. That night, I lay awake in bed, replaying a moment by the fire over and over in my mind. His words, his touch, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me. It all felt too intimate, too close. But instead of feeling wrong, it left me wanting more. And that terrified me. The next morning, I avoided him again, keeping busy with my cousins and helping Lindsay prepare for the family barbecue. But as the day wore on, I found myself drawn back to him, unable to keep my distance. In the late afternoon, I found him in the garden, kneeling by the flower beds Grandma had planted years ago. "Need help?" I asked, surprising even myself with the question. He looked up, his face lighting up with a smile. "Sure, if you don't mind getting your hands dirty." I knelt beside him, the smell of earth and flowers filling the air. We worked side by side in silence for a while, but the tension between us was palpable. "You've been avoiding me," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. I froze, my hands stilling in the dirt. "I haven't." He turned to me, his gaze piercing. "You have, and I don't blame you." I didn't know what to say, so I stayed silent, staring down at the flowers. "I want you to know," he continued, "that I'd never do anything to hurt you. You mean too much to me for that." "I know," I said softly, my voice barely audible. He reached out, his hand resting lightly on my arm. "I'm here for you, Jenna. Always." I looked up at him, my heart racing as our eyes met. For a moment, it felt like the rest of the world faded away, leaving just the two of us in the quiet of the garden. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat on the porch swing, staring out at the lake. I knew I was standing on the edge of something I didn't fully understand, something that could change everything, and part of me wanted to take the leap. The attic smelled of dust and aged wood, the scent stirring faint memories of childhood summers spent rummaging through old trunks. I had come up here to escape the noise of the family barbecue, seeking a moment of solitude. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses drifted faintly through the open window, but up here, everything felt quieter. Grandpa Henry had been the one to suggest I check the attic. "See if you can find that old photo album," he'd said earlier, his eyes lighting up with nostalgia. "The one your grandma used to keep on the top shelf. I think you'll love it." I didn't question him, partly because I welcomed the chance to get away. But as I sifted through the boxes, pulling out old photos and yellowed envelopes. The sound of footsteps on the creaky stairs startled me. "Find anything interesting?" I turned to see Grandpa Henry standing at the top of the stairs, a faint smile on his face. "Not yet," I said, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "There's a lot of stuff up here. Mind if I help?" he asked, stepping into the room. "Sure," I said, scooting over to make room. We worked side by side, sorting through boxes and pulling out items that hadn't seen the light of day in decades. For a while it felt easy, the rhythm of our movements and the occasional laugh grounding us in the familiarity of family history. "Look at this," he said, holding up an old scarf. "Your grandma used to wear this every winter. Drove me crazy because she refused to buy a new one, even when it started to unravel." I laughed, taking the scarf from him. "It still smells like her." "She had a way of leaving her mark on everything," he said, his voice softening. The moment lingered, his words hanging in the air like the dust motes swirling in the dim light. I felt his gaze on me, and when I looked up, the warmth in his eyes made my breath catch. We kept working, but as the minutes passed, the air in the attic seemed to grow heavier. As I reached for a box on the top shelf, I felt his hand on my back, steadying me. "Careful," he said, his voice low. "I'm fine," I said quickly, but I didn't move away. His hand lingered, sliding slightly lower as I stepped back down. The touch was subtle, but it sent a shiver through me that I couldn't ignore. "Got it," I said, holding up the box. "Let's see," he said, brushing the dust off the lid. Inside were more photos, along with a few letters tied together with a faded ribbon. As we flipped through them, our shoulders brushed, and I felt the warmth of his presence more acutely than I wanted to admit. "Jenna," he said after a while, his voice soft. "Yeah, you've grown into an amazing woman," he said, his hand brushing against mine as he reached for a photo. "Your grandma would be so proud of you." "Thanks," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He turned to me, his expression serious. He turned to me, his expression serious. "I mean it. You have this light about you, the kind that draws people in." His words made my chest tighten, a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name, swirling inside me. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, looking down at the photo in my hands. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. His hand moved slowly, sliding from my shoulder to the back of my neck. His fingers brushed against my skin, sending a jolt through me that left me frozen. "Grandpa," I started, but my voice trailed off. "You're special, Jenna," he said softly, his thumb tracing a line along my neck. "You always have been." The warmth of his touch, the weight of his words, they left me torn between a sense of safety and a growing unease. My thoughts spun wildly, trying to make sense of what was happening. "This isn't right, but it doesn't feel wrong. Say something. Move. Say something. Move." "But do you want to?" Before I could decide, his hand moved lower, brushing against the collar of my t-shirt. His fingers curled around the fabric, lifting it slightly. My breath caught as I felt the cool air against my skin, the boundary between us dissolving with every passing second. "Jenna?" he said again, his voice filled with something I couldn't name. The sound of my phone ringing shattered the moment like glass breaking. I jumped, pulling away quickly as I fumbled for my phone. Lindsay's name lit up the screen, her smiling photo a stark contrast to the tension in the attic. "I need to take this," I said, my voice trembling. He nodded, his hand falling back to his side as he stepped away. "Of course," he answered the call, my voice shaky. "Hey, Lindsay, where are you?" she asked, her tone light and cheerful. Arturo, we're about to start a game, and you're missing it. I'll be right there, I said quickly, glancing back at Grandpa Henry. He gave me a faint smile, but his eyes held something I couldn't quite read. As I turned to leave the attic, my thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and unease. I didn't know what had just happened, or what would happen next. The attic felt impossibly small as I hurried down the stairs, my phone still clutched tightly in my hand. Lindsay's voice echoed faintly in my ear as she talked about the game they were setting up. But I wasn't listening. My thoughts were too loud. A chaotic whirlwind of guilt, confusion, and something I wasn't ready to admit. I reached the bottom of the stairs, pausing to catch my breath. The house seemed quieter now. The distant hum of voices from the backyard barely audible. I could still feel the warmth of his touch on my neck, the weight of his words lingering in the air. Lindsay was waiting for me in the living room, holding a deck of cards and grinning like she hadn't a care in the world. Finally, what took you so long? Just got caught up looking for that photo album, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She handed me a handful of cards and began explaining the rules of the game. I nodded along, forcing myself to smile and laugh at the right moments. But all the while, I could feel his presence. Not physically, but like a shadow lingering just out of sight. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I stayed close to Lindsay, hoping her bubbly energy would drown out the storm raging inside me. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes were on me, even when I wasn't looking. When the games finally ended and everyone began retreating to their rooms, I lingered in the kitchen, hoping to avoid him. But as I turned to leave, there he was, standing in the doorway. "Jenna," he said softly, his voice low and familiar. I froze, gripping the counter behind me. "Grandpa, can we talk?" he asked, stepping closer. I hesitated, my chest tightening. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Please," he said, his gaze steady. "Just for a minute." He nodded reluctantly, knowing I should leave but unable to move. He walked into the room, his steps slow and deliberate, and stopped just a few feet away. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt deafening. "I never meant to make you uncomfortable," he said finally, his voice trembling slightly. His eyes softened and he took another step closer. "You're special to me, Jenna. You always have been, Grandpa." Let me finish," he said, his voice firmer now. "I know this. This is how things are supposed to be. But I can't help how I feel. And I don't think you can either." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, stealing the air from my lungs. "I don't know what you mean," I said weakly, though we both knew that wasn't true. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch sent a shiver through me, and I pulled away instinctively. "Don't," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I'm sorry," he said, his hand dropping to his side. I needed you to know." The room felt impossibly small, the walls closing in around us. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "I need to go," I said finally, turning toward the door. "Jenna," he called after me, his voice breaking, but I didn't look back. I spent the rest of the night in my room, staring at the ceiling as tears streamed down my face. I felt broken, torn between the bond I had always cherished and the way it had been twisted into something I didn't understand. By morning I knew what I had to do. At breakfast the air was thick with unspoken tension. Grandpa Henry avoided my gaze, focusing intently on his plate. Lindsay chattered on about plans for the day, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. When the meal ended, I asked my mom if we could talk privately. She nodded, her brow furrowing with concern, as we stepped outside onto the porch. "What's going on, Jenna?" she asked gently. I hesitated, my throat tightening. "It's about Grandpa," I said finally, my voice trembling. Her expression shifted, worry and confusion mingling in her eyes. What about him? I told her everything. The moments that had seemed innocent but weren't. The things he'd said, the way he'd touched me. By the time I finished, tears were streaming down my face, and my hands were trembling. She pulled me into her arms, holding me tightly as I sobbed. I'm so sorry, Jenna, she whispered. I should have seen this. I should have protected you. The fallout was swift and devastating. My mom confronted Grandpa Henry that afternoon, her voice trembling with anger and heartbreak as she told him to leave. The rest of the family watched in stunned silence, their disbelief turning to anger as the truth sank in. He left without a word, his once warm presence now a shadow that lingered in the corners of the house. The family never recovered. The cracks spread quickly, dividing us in ways that felt impossible to mend. Some defended him, insisting that he'd never do such a thing, while others cut ties completely. But despite the pain, I knew I'd done the right thing. Months later, as I sat in my college dorm room, I found myself staring out the window, thinking about that summer. The warmth of his touch, the weight of his words, they still haunted me. But they didn't define me. I'd survived. I'd spoken the truth, even when it felt like it would break me. And that was something he could never take away. Thank you for following Jenna's journey. If you'd like to explore more stories of resilience and healing, let me know.